Night drives are on my list when I think about relaxing things to do when I'm bored. Listening to some of your favorite music, just you and the road, the illusion of endless possibilities like the world is in your palm. Sounds great, doesn't it? Except maybe when an entity is chasing you, or cannibals, whichever one really. In today's video we will be going over 6 terrifying stories, ranging from an entity residing in a young man's home, to a railroad worker who has some of the worst luck imaginable. Then we will be closing things off with a couple of night drive stories. The writers' links can be found in the description. Huge thank you to them for allowing me to share their stories with all of you. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com if you'd like to have it featured in a video. Likes and comments are always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. I would also like to say, since this is the last video of the year, thank you all for making 2018 what it was. Without going into too much depth, this channel and of course, all of you, have helped me through a year that would have been tough to get through without having something like this as an outlet. So let's make 2019 even better. Enjoy the stories. And as always, I hope you all have a great rest of your year. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my aunt convinced my mom to move into a duplex with her. My aunt and cousin had the left side, and my mom, my brother, and I had the right side of the duplex. The duplex had 2 stories. The upstairs had a door that at one point connected both sides, but it had been sealed shut. The house was very old. All the doors had those old locks that required skeleton keys. Basically everything about the house was vintage. Being that young, I was very innocent, and hadn't experienced anything that I couldn't explain. When we first moved in, we all slept in the upstairs room. The stairway had a door that of course opened up to a narrow staircase, with no handrail. My cousin thoroughly enjoyed scaring the crap out of us, by beating on the other side of the wall in the middle of the night. He would also tell us stories of a man being buried alive in one of the upstairs walls. I didn't believe his stories. And still don't. Ironically, around that time, weird stuff started happening in the house. We would be sleeping upstairs, and all of a sudden I'd wake up to the feeling I was being watched. At the same time, it would get really cold. I would just lay back down and try to go to sleep. Weirdly, nothing happened on the ground floor. It was all upstairs. It elevated to the extreme feeling something was standing inches away from me, since I slept on my side. Like all of my senses would go into overdrive, and my body got this tingling feeling. But I'd be too scared to roll over and look. Keeping my eyes closed kept me in sanctuary, or so I thought. One time I had a friend from school come over, and we were upstairs playing PlayStation. 1 second we looked around the room, then back to the screen. And the next second everything hanging on the wall in the room hit the floor. The only thing is, we didn't notice till we looked up from our game. It didn't make any noise. My friend decided to just go ahead and call his dad to come get him. From that point on, we slept downstairs. My mom was in denial over the whole thing. Mom ignored it all till a day she and I were sitting on the living room couch, and heard someone stomp from the center of the upstairs room to the top of the staircase. There was no one upstairs. My mom looked at me, and I saw desperation and fear wash across her face. She told me, "I'm going to look upstairs just to check things out. Stay down here, and if you hear anything, call 911. It was just dark enough out that the upstairs was pitch black from down the staircase. Mom flipped the light on and slowly ascended the stairs. I looked up as she got to the top to see confusion on her face. She saw nothing up there. As she turned to walk back towards me, one of my old baseballs was launched at her head from across the room. It missed her head by an inch. As she looked at the ball, something hit her dead center of the lower back. It hit with so much force she was lifted off her feet, missed all 14 steps, and landed face first in a scorpion-like pose. The light from the stairs was vigorously flickering. She came to and crawled towards me, as I cowered down in the living room. The staircase door slammed shut, and something stomped back across the room. Mom was lucky enough to not be seriously injured, somehow, as we were too poor to go to the hospital anyways. We moved out in less than a week. That whole week was filled with dread and fear until we left the place. That was my first experience of paranormal activity. I've heard so many scary stories from different professions, I figured I could share my own. I'll start out by describing my area, and the history for a little background. I am in the southeastern United States. We have lots of Civil War battlegrounds and trackside graves, etc. There's an area just south of Nashville called Chapel Hill, Tennessee. The story is at night, around midnight, you can see the light of an old school swinging lantern, with a headless corpse carrying it, walking down the tracks. The corpse of a man who was once a conductor, who was decapitated after falling off a moving train. Our locomotive cabs have 3 seats in them. The left seat, conductor, center, the extra or brakeman, and right, the engineer. I got called on a 2-man crew to run the Chapel Hill line. We rolled into the town at about 11:50 p.m., and out of nowhere we went into emergency. My conductor goes to walk the train, leaving me alone in the cab. After about 10 minutes, all of my lights go out and come back on, and I see a figure standing on the tracks in front of our stopped train. Thinking it was my conductor, I leave my seat and go out the cab door to see what's wrong. I get on the ground and see nobody around anywhere. I was freaked out at this point, so I just got back on and sat down. At this point I looked in my rearview mirrors and saw a figure moving on my second unit. I radioed my conductor asking where he was, just to hear that he was 30 cars back from me. I walked to the second unit and found nothing. At this point I'm frustrated and creeped out, and basically stranded in this nowhere town on a haunted stretch of tracks. I go back to the lead locomotive. A few minutes pass. I feel like I'm being watched, so I turn to the left to see a corpse with no head rising out of the conductor's seat coming right at me. I'm frozen with fear at this point. Right as it gets a few feet from me, it just disappeared. I then saw a lantern swing moving, away from my train. My conductor happened to see it on his way back, and asked why I was outside with my lantern. I explained what happened as we got back on our way. But that was a freaky night. Being in this career, you may see things the average 9-to-5 worker doesn't see. One night, just outside of a little town in southern Middle Tennessee called Tullahoma, we were traveling southbound doing about 60 miles per hour. Just to set the scene a little better, it was around 2:30 a.m. The rural area, along with nothing but the sound of your locomotive, can be somewhat eerie. As we came over a hill onto a bit of flat land, I could vaguely see the lights of a car racing to the upcoming road crossing. At 60 miles per hour, you're on something before you know it. I'm blowing my horn away more than normal, 2 longs, a short, and a long through a crossing. I gave all the warning I could. The car didn't stop. They always told me don't make eye contact with the person you're about to hit. I've also been told during moments of extreme emotional distress, you remember in great detail what you saw. The split second of fear in her eyes was traumatizing. She was the most beautiful dark-haired, blue-eyed beauty in a black dress I'd ever seen. They say real beauty is on the inside. I must disagree, because the brain matter on my locomotive plow looked nowhere near as good as the woman that once possessed it. This experience happened on the previous division I worked on. I worked the 110-mile main line between Kingsport, Tennessee, and Shelby, Kentucky. This route goes through the Appalachian Mountains, and also passes through the coal fields and mines that once had the area's dead economy booming. This is now one of the poorest areas in America. You often see almost unlivable shacks with families in them along the tracks. When I was a young blood, the old heads and locals told me of the folklore and tales of the mountains. Just figured I was getting hazed, since I'd now been here 15 years, and had never seen any of it. Well, until now. I got called for a train out of Kingsport for 9 p.m. I arrived at the yard office at 8:30 p.m. and greeted my conductor. He was just out of training and this was going to be his first trip. His name was Chris, and after a short conversation, I thought I'd like working with him. We boarded the locomotive, and by about 9:30 p.m. we were given the track warrants and green-lighted to leave. I notched the throttle back and let her eat. As an engineer, you have to constantly be aware of your surroundings. After leaving, I noticed a little movement in the second unit. "Damn hobos," I said. We ended up having to take siding just before going into Virginia and meet another train. I took the opportunity to investigate the movement in the second unit. I turned on the locomotive cab lights and looked around. Engineer's seat, clear. Conductor seat, clear. Out of random bodily urge, I went to the engine bathroom to piss. I unzipped my pants and opened the door, to find a 25-year-old young man huddled on the ground shivering. It was the middle of winter, December 23rd to be exact. I got him up, showed him how to work the heater, and sat him down. He was trying to get to Big Stone Gap, Virginia, for Christmas. I said, "Well, you're in luck. We'll slow down so you can get off there." He smiled and thanked me, and I went back to the lead unit, because we had been given a green signal to leave. We were going through the most rural areas of the route from this point on. It takes a strong mind to do this. The loneliness, the nighttime silence, only being broken by your conductor's voice calling signals, and the miles of open track and darkness can get to a weak person. Around 3 a.m. we were approaching Natural Tunnel. All it is a 2-mile-long cave the railroad track was built through. A lot of Indians were killed on these hillsides. As we went through the Natural Tunnel, our mid-train power locomotive lost radio contact in the cave with the lead engine. This put on needed stress on the couples, causing the train to split in half. We put the train in emergency, and once we fully stopped, we determined the train needed to be walked. Normally the conductor would go alone, but Chris was scared. So I decided to walk with Chris, and we walked by the light of his lantern. Our train was 2 miles long, and we found the broken knuckle coupler about halfway. We fixed the knuckle, and I had to leave Chris to return to the locomotive for the reverse maneuver. I was about 3/4 of the way back to the lead unit, before Chris radioed me asking me where I was. I told him and got no response, but proceeded on. I got on the engine and got ready to make the move, so I radioed Chris letting him know I was ready. After about 4 minutes without a response, I repeated myself. After another 2 or 3 minutes, I figured the signal came and went in the cave. I radioed dispatch telling them what happened, and to be on standby. I grabbed my flashlight and started making my way back towards Chris. Once I got in sight of his lantern, I called to him with a loud echo off the cave walls. All of a sudden, I saw Chris's body go flying from between the cars that had broken couplers, and hit the cave wall with a loud thud. He slid to the ground as my attention was drawn back to the area he was launched from. Something was standing there. It must have been 8 to 10 feet tall. Its head turned towards me with the reddest glowing eyes I've ever seen. As soon as it made eye contact with me, it let out this low, gut-wrenching growl. As I turned to run, it jumped from between the cars, and hit the ground with so much power my legs came out from under me. I caught myself and hopped back up and ran towards the lead unit with everything I had. I heard it running behind me. It continued to gain on me. The engine was in sight, so I gave every ounce I had left and finally dived for the grab irons and steps. I scurried into the cab and locked the doors. I looked around the windows and saw nothing outside. I radioed dispatch in a panic and told them what happened, though I was barely audible. They told me to proceed with what I had left of a train to the Big Stone Gap and authorities, and another engineer would be there to relieve me. I put the throttle in run 8 full throttle. As soon as I stepped off the engine, my legs became jello, and I fell to the ground. As the EMTs tended to me, I looked up at the second unit and saw those same red glowing eyes looking out at me from the window. I passed out after that. I was awoken in the hospital by a very inquisitive detective. He explained to me that they could only positively identify Chris with dental records. Chris had been mauled so bad they didn't have any animal on record that attacked in that manner. My brain had shut most of it out at that time, so I was useless to the case. As the detective left, he stopped and turned towards me. "Oh yeah, do you know anything about the dead 25-year-old we found in the second unit? We found him with his chest plate broken and his ribs split open from the center." I passed out again after the gruesome details. Come to find out, a few track workers and hobos that had family that knew their last whereabouts and cared enough to report them missing disappeared in the area. I was eventually able to get past all this and go back to work. About a week after returning, I was sitting in the Kingsport locker room. An old head sat down beside me and said, "You must be lucky. Not many survive a Wendigo the first time." I transferred divisions a week later. My mother and I were driving to a house that our family has in northern Michigan, and it was roughly a 6-hour drive. We left in the morning, and after a couple of stops, I wanted to stop to get some coffee. We were only a few minutes away from the nearest town, but we were quickly running out of gas. I saw an exit titled 222, and we took it. It was a small, depressed town. Everyone drove beater cars, and there was a fair share of trailer homes, and seemingly poor people. Running out of gas, we needed to stop at a station. We stopped at Louis Gas and Supermarket. It was unassuming from the outside, and as I was walking in to go to the bathroom, my mother and I saw a man walking out of the store. He had ragged clothing on, unshaven and limping. We saw him carrying some pork out to his waiting car with his wife. It was strange, but I decided to go ahead into the store. It was almost like a warehouse turned supermarket, as there were high ceilings, concrete walls, and floor, and it was rather cold. A few grumbling employees looked my way as I walked through the aisles of cheap food and cat litter. I walked to the bathroom, and as I was unzipping my pants, I heard mechanical whirring and clicking of something a few rooms over. As it was muffled and suppressed, I didn't think much of it, being a grocery store, but that was before I heard a scuffle and some yelling, then quiet. Odd quietness. The fan stopped in the bathroom, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights, everything. That silence only heightened my curiosity. As I finished my business, I exited the bathroom, and saw a door that was titled Employees Only, that was a mere few steps away. I looked over my shoulder, searching for anyone around, and proceeded towards the door. I pressed my ear against the door, and I could faintly hear what sounded like a table saw. I slowly opened the door and peered in. Instantly, a cold metallic smell wafted out of the door, almost like a wind. I opened it more and saw a cold, dark warehouse. I took one step in. I began walking inside of the room, slowly stepping as to not cause noise with my wingtip shoes. The mechanical noises started getting louder and louder, and I reached a segment of the room lit with bright fluorescent lights, with blood-stained white tile and white cloth. I crouched behind a stack of pallets, examining more closely what I caught a glimpse of. As soon as I hid, 2 men walked into the room, one carrying a white bag over his shoulder, and the other going to a room with a key in his hand. The first man threw the bag onto the table, and the second man inserted the key into the lock and opened the door. I heard screaming. The man had a pole with a rope at the end, and he began leading a fairly full-sized man out of the room. The man was bounded by the hands and gagged. The first man pulled a body out of the bag and turned on a table saw and began dissecting the body by cutting off the woman's arms and legs. The second man then cleaved the head off of the live man. splattering warm blood across the room, some getting on my face. As the two men worked with pliers, chainsaws, bandsaws, and table saws, the former humans were reduced to mere entrails, limbs, and sections of meat. In but a few minutes, one of them turned on a meat grinder and began feeding the limbs of the dead woman into it, filling sausage casings. The other started bagging limbs in plastic bags and putting them on ice. I knocked over a pair of pliers, and they wheeled around, astounding that I was there. I immediately bolted out of the room, making a beeline for the front doors. As I was weaving in and out of aisles, I could hear a sizable group of employees pursuing me. I was near the counter, and I picked up 2 pots of freshly brewed gas station coffee. I threw 2 onto the ground in front of them, causing them to slip and fall on broken glass, and picked up the 2, throwing them, breaking, and spilling scalding coffee on their bodies. As they writhed, I was able to get away more quickly, but one still followed. He was roughly 6 feet 8 inches tall, at least 400 pounds, and very muscular. He was the first man I saw in the room. He was the only one left, and I began to book it towards my mother's car. She was still not done pumping gas, and she started screaming when she saw this blood-soaked man pursuing me, and started the car. The man was right behind me, and thinking quickly, I took the nozzle out of the car and sprayed him with gasoline. He struck at me with his cleaver, hit the concrete, and caused a good deal of sparks, and lit himself on fire. I immediately heard blood-curdling screaming. As he screamed and clutched his face in agony, I hopped in the passenger seat of the car, and we drove as fast as our Lexus could go. I looked behind me, and the entire gas station was up in flames, and the man was almost entirely melted into the concrete. All I saw were the disheveled employees, standing against the glass, staring at me and smiling. No other customers were there. If any of you are ever going into northern Michigan, never take exit 222. I was passing time behind the counter talking with coworkers when I overheard a man arguing with my boss about how he should be able to return coffee if he hadn't touched it. My coworker said the same man was here last night, and that he ordered the most absurd amount of coffee. This weak argument didn't make it past my boss, and he was quickly denied. Curiosity got the best of my coworker, and she approached the counter and began questioning where he went last night with his arms full of coffee. The man, who I now was scanning closely, was very unkempt and sported bloodshot eyes. Obviously, something with my co's question struck a nerve, as he suddenly became very paranoid, and given his appearance, it made everyone behind the counter very aware and nervous. He looked around the shop before motioning, asking my co to come around the counter. She quickly looked over to me and our other employees for help before we all approached the man. By this point, he is trembling, but once I am closer, I realize he is shaking with excitement, holding himself with a giant smile, surrounded by messy scruff. He began to speak about how he had stayed up all night to visit his girlfriend. Immediately after he began his rambling, I recognized the name of his girlfriend as the girl who had recently gone missing, with no leads in her case. This isn't a small town, but everyone knew that girl because her case was so baffling. She went missing after leaving her house to drive to her work. The girl just disappeared, along with her car and everything in it. My coworkers must have realized too, as the tone shifted from fear to sympathy, and I believe we all thought he was going crazy out of grief for his lost girlfriend. After we lost interest in the conversation and dismissed him, he still stood in front of the counter and continued on with his drivel. What ended up catching my attention was his conspiracies behind his girlfriend's disappearance. My coworkers had gone back to talking or cleaning up the mess from his order, while I lingered close enough to hear his developing theory. Once he saw me listening, he started directing his story towards me. This man restarted from the beginning of his rant. He said it all began when he saw his girlfriend in a trance-like state, Approaching her car minutes after she arrived home, hours after her expected arrival. Upon confrontation, she simply kissed him goodbye before driving away towards work. After his girlfriend left, he said he went back into their room to see if he had confiscated any drinks from the work party she attended the night before. That would explain her behavior, but he couldn't help but notice her open journal lying on their bed. The police confiscated the pages for investigation, but he was able to transcribe what it said to another paper and hide it during researches. This is when he pulled out his copy of the journal entry and showed me what it said. 12/3/18. This was only brought to my attention last night, when I didn't return from my shift until this morning at sunrise instead of at night. When I was driving to work once the sun fully set, I heard a noise behind my car and went to check my rear view for the culprits. In my mirror there was absolutely no lights except in the areas where my taillights illuminated, which isn't that odd. What was odd was the figure, who looked to be a young teen girl, approaching from the edge of the darkness. I kept driving, but also watched the sights unfolding behind me. Instantly, an overpowering sense of dread filled me once I comprehended what was happening. The girl never moved past the darkness, and pursued at the same speed as my car. I looked away from the rear, because I wasn't trying to fall victim to a car accident, but found myself victim to a much larger horror. Ahead of me, where there should have been an intersection, lay a straight, barely lit, seemingly never-ending road littered with the street signs every inch of the way. Also, no other cars were anywhere in sight, even though I knew I was just behind an unmistakable bright red minivan. I understood that if I stopped my car and the light that shielded my car left, I would be openly inviting the thing behind my car access to close the gap and follow through with whatever their intentions were. Once my tears and shock had subsided enough to focus on something other than driving, I took a closer look at the side of the road. All the signs had the same message: "Don't stop driving." Well, I already knew this. Behind the bold text was different images, each of different people, and each with explicit torture being acted on them. I checked back on my personal shadow to see that the girl was crying. Horrible howls echoed through the air. I kept my eyes on her for a while, and saw that she was mouthing at me. It looked like she was asking me to stop my car. I looked away. I couldn't stand to watch her torture. I then checked my gas. Always had a full tank before my shift, and with that I continued my driving. Nothing ever changed, besides the songs I played on the radio to keep me awake and distract me from my living nightmare. As the sun began to rise, the horrid land before me was replaced with the same street I was on before. The first time I checked my rear view. The same street. This is when you'll remember me coming home and rushing up to my room with a shitty work party and dead phone excuse. Which isn't exactly a lie, because even though my radio seemed to keep connection, my phone wouldn't pick up any signal. What messed me up the most was I had gotten a note stuck to the back of my car, which freaked me out because that little thing behind my car didn't leave the darkness, or at least not while I was looking at it. The note feels heavy, but it's just a sealed envelope with nothing on it. I plan on opening the note now. By now the man was even more giddy. When I was on the verge of tears, I questioned him on what this has to do with anything, and he told me he got a message from his girlfriend. He pulled out a letter, but it was unopened. He said the police resealed it after investigation, but seriously they did an amazing job because it looked practically untouched. The seal was still very intact. The man claimed it was on the back of his car, after he himself went to the same nightmare world his wife had driven in the nights of her alleged account. I didn't want to upset such a disturbed man, so I opened the letter. I understand now. I have to help his girlfriend. He told me to wait until sunset, and to look out my rearview mirror until I see her following me. I know what to do next. I have enough gas to make it until sunfall. I grabbed a coffee from behind the counter and went into my car. My coworkers were yelling at me, but I could barely hear them. As I drove away, I saw him waving me off, with the biggest smile spreading across his face as he held my coworkers back.